Welcome everybody, welcome. We're going to go over Star Citizen, another deep dive into Star Citizen's development history. We've got a lot of stuff to go over today. We're basically going to start from the first mention of 4.0 that I know of. And from there, we're going to watch a bunch of footage about how things have progressed in expectations, in plans, in what they have said and marketed about 4.0, and where we are now in the lead up to it. Why don't we jump right into it? Starting off with the first time I remember getting 4.0 getting mentioned, also probably the most embarrassing mention of 4.0, let's be honest. Star Citizen CitizenCon 2016. This whole segment of CitizenCon was about the year of 2017. It was expected that we would get 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, and then 4.0 all in a year, being basically one after the other with each quarter. Obviously, 4.0 did not come after 3.3. Miscalculated timelines in the lead up to here. So let's listen to what he has to say about it and what was expected.
Here we go. And then finally, 4.0. So this is which will be, that'll be the first time we'll go beyond Stanton to other star systems. I'm not going to say how many star systems yet. Depends how much we'll be able to build with our content pipeline, which we'll show you a little bit up and coming here. But we're very focused on, if you've seen some of the ATV, how to author star systems at the quality level that we like, with a sense of lore and art and character and history, but be able to do planets, because sometimes in FPS games people spend forever years just making a small 2x2 kilometer level, and obviously for us to build the system, the universe that we need to be a bit faster than that. But we will have 4.0 is when you will be able to jump to other star systems. Exploration and discovery will be sort of highlight there for obvious reasons. Science and research, and the RSI Orion and the Crucible will be two of the big ships that we will be doing there. So that's the roadmap for Star Citizen.
Imagine if we were expected to get the Orion and the Crucible in 4.0 at this point. See, I do take the things they say now more seriously because they were able to go through these blunders and kind of get some perspective. But man, this was just wildly off. That was the first mention of 4.0. Now, obviously, he didn't mention any particular systems here. This was October of 2016. We didn't get any systems mentioned, so there wasn't really this expectation that Pyro was coming with 4.0. But then a year later, at CitizenCon of 2017, we're jumping a full year forward, Chris said this.
And that little the red cluster you see up there is actually the Pyro system. So when we leave Stanton, that will be one of our destinations.
That is literally all I care about from this hour-long video. But I think, I might be wrong here, somebody could correct me, I'm pretty sure that was the first time they really alluded to the fact that Pyro was going to be the next or one of the next systems. I think it was theorized by then, and backers were kind of guessing it, but that was when he came out and said it. So this is another year later, we're jumping forward. Let's just listen to this. This is talking about persistence and server meshing and kind of where they wanted to take that stuff.
So the server meshing is the last key piece, because that will allow us to have a truly massively populated universe of players as well as AI, and having servers that dynamically scale up and down to take care of the processing needs of that. And so from our standpoint, in terms of what we would think is the experience when you guys can sit in and play the game day after day and not worry about it getting wiped, not worrying about, oh, I'm going to do something for a day or two and there's no point because they're going to reset the system. When we get to full persistence and server meshing, that's our marker. And sure, after that, we've got planets to do and star systems, and we're going to have continual feature development. But this is an online live game, and so for us, we don't have a particular viewpoint in terms of, oh, that's it, this is where we finish it, and we don't do any more work. It's like literally, we kind of view, as long as you guys want to live in this universe, every 3 months, we're giving you a build, and here you are, and here's a bit more, and here's a bit more, and here's a bit more. And when we get to
the full persistence of server meshing, I think at that point, that's when we're not going to be resetting the servers. It's when it will be an ongoing, living, breathing game.
I don't think that's true anymore. Obviously, this game is nowhere near. I mean, they could drop in server meshing, we still won't have quantum, right? So the economy still needs to catch up. Like you said, plenty of features will still need to be there. We won't have base building. We probably won't have farming. Doesn't seem like we're going to have long distance scanning. The reputation system doesn't look like it's going to be very well developed. There are so many things that are going to be missing, even when we get server meshing, that I just don't think it will be what he's talking about here. But I do understand that server meshing is kind of like the big technological hurdle. You're going to notice this a lot throughout this sort of journey to 4.0, that their idea of what 4.0 represents changes a little bit. And I think there was actually another big change around 2020, which we'll see as we review this stuff as well. Like, this presentation was the first time we really got a realistic idea of the long-term idea, what they wanted to do with Star Citizen. That's not including all the gameplay stuff, but just in terms of like the major beats. Here they talk a little bit more about the challenges of the roadmap and what their plans are going forward. Again, just a little snippet, but there are a lot of little moments like this throughout the last 4 years where you hear a couple things being said, and they have to help you recalibrate how you're thinking about the work that they're going through.
We just added a 4.0 to the end of our roadmap with the changes that we made last week. Some folks think the logical patch number increase from 3.9 would be 3.10 as the 10th major patch for software version 3. With 4.0 on the roadmap, should we expect a similarly larger leap in gameplay experience like the one we saw with 2.0 or with 3.0?
I would like to think so. I mean, I think obviously if we get server-side OCS, most of Stanton would be there, if not all. So having a full system there, like that to me is a huge, that to me is like a vertical slice.
Yeah.
This is a galaxy or a solar system for us, and so obviously we got more to create, but then that would be, hey, here's our stake in the ground. Here we have all the celestial bodies, in this. I think that would be huge and would warrant a number change.
So that was super key. First, we realized that 3.10 was supposed to be 4.0 at one point, but also that they weren't even talking about a new star system with 4.0. Pyro was not part of 4.0 at this point. He's saying, hey, we're going to have Stanton complete, all the planets, vertical slice of what Star Citizen is meant to be with all the different gameplay mechanics going on, and that's our 4.0 jump. And honestly, that would have been pretty cool. Pyro is a lot of work, and I don't think they needed Pyro for 4.0. I think they included Pyro in 4.0 because server meshing took so long. It does seem like server meshing was ultimately the goal for 4.0, and Pyro was just kind of something they threw on top of that goal. But here, they're very clearly saying, we just want to have a good representation of the game for 4.0, and that would be whatever comes out when it does, which 3.10 was not in the cards. So that's 2019, September of 2019. We still really hadn't gotten that much information on what Pyro was meant to be or anything like that. Okay, so this would be a month after the video we just watched where they were talking about 3.10, 4.0, and how the Stanton vertical slice would kind of be what they wanted 4.0 to be.
We are going to have the Pyro system next year. Obviously, that brings in jump points. We're going to have dynamic weather. We're going to be, Microtech, you're going to get the planet itself in 3.8, but we'll be opening up new Babbage in 3.9. We've got moons of Microtech that come in, I think, in 3.9 too. And we'll be continuing on the development of SOCs and the iCache and the persistence.
See, this... It doesn't. I don't know, guys. This was a month before.
Server-side OCS, most of Stanton would be there, if not all. So having a full system there, like that to me is a huge, that huge. That to me is like a vertical slice.
Yeah.
You know, this is a galaxy or a solar system for us. And
So I get that maybe they were being very quiet about Pyro and Todd wasn't allowed to talk about Pyro here. It's just jarring that 1 month later, or 2 months later, this is Pyro and this is what's coming with 4.0.
And we'll be continuing on the development of socks and the iCache and the persistence. And
iCache was probably a decent setback for them technologically speaking, because I do know that by this time, 2019, they were hiring people for server meshing. They were actively working on their concept of server meshing. It just, you know, these things kind of domino effect and snowball, and it seems like they really got thrown off their game, probably partially because of iCache, partially because they weren't actually near as ready as we were kind of being told at this point, and partially because of the pandemic. Shortly after that, we followed up with some talk about jump points.
Some previs was done, I think, back in 2014, 2015. A lot of early concepts went out to Chris. I was working with Marcel on the concept side of things. So we've done a lot of loose investigations first to understand, do we want something big, do we want something that's small, does it fit into the lore of SC? There's several things that you can play with, such as, you know, is it spherical, is it cylindrical, is it square? The very kind of like core shapes that you can kind of play with, and then how that thing would operate, how you'd enter it, what's it look like to the third person as well as the first person. So just to get those ideas out there, and then several iterations for weeks, right? And then we kind of like settled on what you kind of saw in the demo.
What starts to happen here is we start to hear more about the development of the Pyro system. Obviously, this is the Stanton jump point, but like we have started to hear, we heard about server meshing being a plan. Now we're starting to hear about Pyro, but they're not necessarily drawing the connection between the two yet. I think it's not until 2 years after this that they finally explicitly say Pyro and 4.0 are intertwined. So jumping into 2020, this is a new year now. 319 finished up with that sort of explanation of jump points and the CitizenCon demo where they said that Pyro is coming the next year. Now let's hear what they have to say about Pyro starting in 2020.
We can do within our first quarter of this year. As we showed at CitizenCon end of last year, we showed that first sneak peek to what Pyro could be. So as myself and as a team, we're all quite excited about starting that process.
Okay. Let's play that again.
Myself and as a team, we're all quite excited about starting that process.
So they're really getting started on the process of building Pyro at this point. This is January of 2020. One could say that their planet tech at that point was good enough to build 4 planets in a year. There wouldn't have been points of interest. There wouldn't have been factions. There wouldn't have been outpost systems. A lot of stuff would have been missing from a Pyro that they put in at any point in 2020. So it is interesting. It almost feels like the jump from what Todd Pappy is saying here about them wanting the complete Stanton to what he's saying here makes more sense than what we heard in that CitizenCon, because I could see them saying mid 2019, yeah, we want to finish off Stanton, and then in early 2020 being like, well, we're starting Pyro because we really wanted that to be in 4.0. And it starts to kind of shift around this point.
But before then, we want to close out these last 3 moons in Stanton. So that time is a factor, because I'm getting pushed by my boss, Chris, to start on this new system.
And then we got posts like this. So this was, this was around that time. This was right after some pretty big delays on the roadmap. For those who weren't around during 2019, 2020, some of this was because of work from home changes and because the pandemic really messed up their workflow. But a lot of this was, I think, just a major refactor in what they were planning on doing. I think at some point they were like, hey, server meshing is going to take a really long time. We need to take a step back and build all these systems to be much better by the time server meshing is ready. So after that, we jump forward a few months to June of 2020. Here is one of the first updates we started to see in Inside Star Citizen as they kind of started to build that hype. And they weren't really calling this the road to 4.0 because, again, Pyro and 4.0 weren't being associated at this time, but you could tell that they were starting to build hype for Pyro.
Speaking of pyromaniacs and what might be the best or worst segue I've made all season, it's time for another look at early work on the planets of the Pyro system, in this case, Pyro 2. Now, in the original galactic guide for the Pyro system, Pyro 2 was said to be a coreless planet that once held significant mineral deposits and became the victim of a metal rush that quickly picked the planet clean, leaving it little more than an empty husk. And, well, we may have to revisit that assessment before all is said and done. Similar to our look at Pyro 1 last month, this is early work on the planet's surface alone, so you can expect plenty of changes and improvements along the way before it gets plopped into the Pyro system.
Chris should not have said that Pyro would be in 2020. Just every time we get another update on how it was, it just doesn't make sense, man. And it starts to explain why he wasn't at CitizenCon 2022. And who knows how much he'll be making those kinds of statements this year, CitizenCon.
System with its family of other planets. But it's fun to showcase what Planet Tech V4 can cook up in a new world's very early days.
That was kind of just to show where the development was at that time in Pyro. Now, at the end of 2020, we're jumping forward quite a bit here. The coverage was still very light. 2020 as a whole, we didn't see a CitizenCon, which is generally where they talk about the major patch like 4.0 and Pyro. So we didn't have that chance for the messaging on Pyro. They were able to kind of easily just skim over the fact that it wasn't there in 2020. Instead, for those of you who were there and remember all the drama, they were kind of building up this idea of, hey, we're going to give you more updates on Squadron 42. We're going to start to give you some more insight into the game, and we're going to show you what we would like to call the briefing room. So we got an episode of the briefing room. This was really the big thing that replaced CitizenCon for that whole year. It was an hour-long video that we actually watched a couple of weeks ago, last week, when we were looking at the Squadron 42 development. It's an hour-long video of them basically just looking at a location from Squadron 42 and talking about the development process of it, which we love development here. That's why we're here, right? But ultimately, this was not a replacement for CitizenCon, and they only did one episode. Keep that in mind, because I'm gonna come back to that later on in this video. And then we got a letter from the chairman at the end of the video, or at the end of the year, December 23rd, 2020. And in this, we talked a lot about, 2020 was tough. COVID-19 caused some problems. They did a lot of stuff to try and update to work from home. But ultimately, this video talked a lot about the year in review, what happened, what the priorities were, the new roadmap that they were getting ready to introduce. The progress tracker wasn't even a thing yet. They were getting that in. And a lot of talk about Squadron 42. A lot. At this point, I think they were starting to realize that Squadron 42 is an awkward topic. And they needed to double down on it. That's why after this, I think it was 6 months after this, 8 months after this, Chris and Sandy announced that they were moving to Manchester. They were actually moving from California to Manchester to kind of get things a little more going on Squadron 42. But throughout this whole letter, all of this letter of the chairman, at the end of 2020, after Pyro had been delayed, 4.0 was not mentioned, nothing had been talked about really besides these inside Star Citizen updates on development, not a single mention of Pyro besides the Grey Cat multi-tool, and not a single mention of 4.0. I don't really remember what I was even doing around this point. I think this would have been a solid time to start to talk about, hey, they didn't talk about 4.0 or Pyro. I think we were very distracted with Squadron 42 at that point, and maybe that was a coincidence. Maybe that was meant to be. I don't know. But at this point, we were getting very little on the long-term goal of Star Citizen and the long-term plan for 4.0 and Pyro. But we continued. And into 2021, we started to hear more talk about the things that would be needed for Pyro. So many of you know that Pyro is a massive system compared to Stanton. This is going to be a huge expansion into the space that we're playing in. You can't fly as many places. You can't be as comfortable traveling around the system. So they were starting to talk about systems that would support that gameplay. And this was one of the first signs that Pyro was not going to be something on its own. It was going to be linked to server meshing, because we'll play this and then I'll talk about it.
But it is still early. Now, I want to clear that statement up. It is still early. We have been talking about refuel and repair in many of these systems throughout Star Citizen development for several years now. When we say it's early days in Spain, that means active development on this feature is now begun.
The scheduling is done for it. We are just ironing out the details in the design. We already talked with a lot of the dependency teams, all the guys that need to provide the art, change the boom arm for refueling.
Talking about refueling, by the way.
How do we do the fuel ports? There's already people. There's gears are in motion for this. This pretty much needs to come with Pyro, because if it doesn't, then a lot of people are going to get stranded in Pyro, and there's going to be no solution for that.
So the developers who are working on these features, refueling, repair, they were talking with the idea of like, we got to get this done because it needs to be ready for Pyro. They didn't have, at least not outwardly towards us, they were not messaging to us that Pyro was a long way away. In their mind, refueling had to get finished in order to get into Pyro. Now, this was July 1st, 2021, and this was April 2nd, 2021. So that's a 2-month difference. But at this point, they already knew that PES wasn't working at this point.
There's a whole bunch of stuff that's already been built, and we're building out the back-end database, what we call the entity graph, that is going to sort of persist and remember the state of every single entity and object in the world. So if you stream out an area, you completely remember the state where everything is, whether you dropped a Coke can in the middle of a forest on a planet, and that aspect of it, opens up obviously the persistence we talked about, which is great, but is also a fundamental building block for the server meshing. So we've been really working hard on that. We're making really good progress to it. I'm not going to promise any dates because it's by far the most technically challenging thing. I will say probably by the end of this year, we should hopefully have the...
Bruh, he just said no dates. How does he do that? It's like 3 seconds.
Hopefully have the proper persistence in there that talk about the proper global persistence, which is this sort of streaming entity graph thing that I've just discussed, which is the new version of what was being called the iCache before, if people are getting confused about that.
Yeah, so that at this point they knew that the iCache was being replaced. I do think that they had made that switch around 2020-ish, and that was part of that delay like we were talking about, but clearly part of the setback. This is another update that we were getting around that time. What is this? So this is April 2021, around the same exact time as what he's saying here. And they're just talking about some of the detailed work they're doing on Pyro.
Moving on to the environment teams, more harvestables are being concepted in development for the upcoming Pyro system, including these devil pods of Pyro 4. Referred to as the animate tree, this is a dried and expansive stalk that grows pods that can be harvested by citizens for the manufacture of heat-resistant textiles. Of the 8 options seen here, we're thinking 5 and 6 are the ones that will likely move forward. It wouldn't be a sprint report without a look at the continuing progress of our colonialism outposts being worked on for Pyro and other frontier systems. Now this week, the props team has begun whiteboxing out some of the various accoutrements that may one day fill the interior spaces.
So we're getting updates on the stuff that's being built, and you still get this idea that like Pyro's being built actively right now. It's not even close to being finished. But whatever they would have dropped in before, if they had gotten Pyro in, wouldn't have had any of this stuff in. They wouldn't have the props. They wouldn't have had the foliage. They wouldn't have had the harvestables or the outposts. And this is a really interesting one. They wouldn't have had music.
How far ahead do you work? You just mentioned Pyro. Are you composing stuff for Pyro right now, or does that come later? Like where in the overall process do you...
This is June 4th of 2021. So around that same time.
Well, sometimes less, sometimes more, but no, usually it's pretty much already 80-90% done, basically. So yeah. So I'm not still working on.
So that's how we know when Pyro is almost done. We just need to spam Pedro. Just keep asking. You working on music yet, buddy?
Pyro. At least I'm not. Well, I've thought about it. Well, I did work a little bit when we did that. Yeah, it's percolating. I did work on it on the CitizenCon demo, quite a bit, and that's so. But apart from that, we've been focused on other locations, on our moons, etc.
The music wasn't being started at that point. Maybe he could have rushed something out, but again, the signs are saying that Pyro is still a ways out at this point, and I don't even think they had started their technical road to 4.0 or Pyro, because again, they hadn't officially said yet that Pyro and 4.0 were coupled. Jumping into CitizenCon of that year, this is where they started to draw the line between Pyro and 4.0, and I think you'll hear it officially for the first time in this video. This was when it really started. It's when they started trying to hype up the system a lot more. But again, at this point, they still hadn't said that server meshing was needed for Pyro.
So when we started looking at Pyro, and we had to start looking at how the jump points work when we're traveling from Stanton to Pyro or Pyro to Stanton, and thinking about border security, the infrastructure that's needed there. What's the lore? Just because on one side it's very lawless versus the other side is dealing with the UEE. So we needed to go through and really think about how this was working. The team has put in a lot of hard work in building the Pyro system, building the AI, building the planets, the worlds that you'll go and explore. So Pyro will be ready when server meshing is, and it will be coming out with Star Citizen Alpha 4.0.
So that was it. That was and this was the Star Citizen. This is a CitizenCon where Chris was not anywhere to be seen. That was the point at which they were like, okay, 4.0, Pyro are both dependent on server meshing. And that was when it started to be like, okay, well, how do we, when is server meshing ready? And thus began the actual wait for 4.0, because server meshing is a kind of a pie in the sky. It's something that already exists. Other games have done it. Dual Citizen's doing it right now. That one game, Scavs, is on Spatial OS, is doing something like it. And other games do certain things like it. But for this game, it has been a struggle for them to get it working, in large part because of the way that they track all the objects through persistent entity streaming. Having every single object in the game be an entity that needs to be actionable, storable, stealable, movable, and then also have those entities be able to transition between servers and save their state between servers and all that kind of stuff has proved to be quite a bit of a challenge for them. But they're still working on it, as we'll see. This is just another update on what they were doing with Pyro at the time.
Now, it's been a while since we checked in on the universe's gas cloud tech, and the environment teams recently completed a sprint exploring some Lagrange point looks for the various planets of the upcoming Pyro system. Each star system, planetary area, and planet itself is designed with a specific color palette in mind at the earliest parts of the process. And some of the coloring you see here may and will change as the lighting passes begin. Additionally, the wrecks you see here are all currently placeholder, as the call has gone out to create more dynamic and in some cases more recognizable debris for the players to explore.
End of 2021, they started to talk about Pyro being a thing. 2022, they got on the road to 4.0. Jumping forward a little bit more, we see yet another update on Pyro progress, kind of again lending some context to where they are in that development cycle.
Into the persistent universe proper. The team is also exploring early advanced traversal opportunities for some of the outlaw space stations currently being built for the Pyro system. If you remember the most recent CitizenCon demo, advanced traversal are ways to get around or through an environment beyond the critical path most people usually stick to. Now, by following a variety of indicators still being developed, including simple things like tracing the path of an unusual cable or scratch marks on the floor,
The players can discover these advanced traversal paths designed to lead not just to interesting tactical opportunities, but special loot and content rewards for those who spend a little extra time exploring.
I do like that with Pyro, we are getting an update to how the game plays. It's not just a copy of Stanton, they're actually building in some good, useful additions to the game. Now with the road to 4.0, we did get a letter mid-year last year. This was the big one that kind of told us that PES was starting to work and things were getting along their way. But as we can see here in the text somewhere, they do talk about, for PES to work, both the entity graph and replication layer need to be functional. We're still waiting on replication layer to be fully implemented. In terms of engineering, this was the biggest technical challenge and required a fundamental reworking of how the game handles authority and state change of entities. In addition, a whole host of new online services were needed to support the replication layer and entity graph. To support PES, we needed to create 12 new services. For server meshing, only 4 more services are currently planned. So PES was a large part of the work that needed to be done for server meshing. And they did report that 16 months of work, 18 engineers, 3 dedicated QA, and 4 producers got them finally to the point where PES was working in a closed environment. About 8 months later, it finally made it into our hands, and we saw just how difficult it was going to be following up from there. So everything that they said in this letter, which was about kind of the lead up to server meshing in 4.0 and the road to 4.0, got set back a bit. And we can see in this graphic here, right here, it says persistent streaming with 3.18. And then DGS server node split, which is a big thing. And then server meshing tech preview, and then server meshing MVP in 4.0. So again, the messaging is that 4.0, server meshing intertwined, but we don't know when it's happening. And with 4.0, we'll be getting a second system, Pyro, so they were reiterating that. And ultimately, it was just, this was the big lead up. And then finally, we got one more letter from the chairman at the end of the year that talked a little bit more about where they wanted to be and where they were at the time. And we were learning kind of that it was a little bit more of a setback than they were expecting. Ultimately, that's around the last update we have. We do have a video on server meshing and what they're doing with it, but it didn't give us too much information. So that about wraps up my full review of kind of where we went. We're seeing a lot of the development that's going on in the meantime, locations and game systems and AI and all this stuff. But will it come together? Nobody really knows. This can be a frustrating and a fun project to follow.